Testing audio. 1, 2, 3. Hello.
Hi. Sorry.
I'm joining. I can talk to it. I'm talking now. Tell me if you can hear me.
Oh, good.
Hello. Testing. 1, 2, 3. Testing. Testing.
To the Georgia Capitol. For those of you that's your first time here, for those of you that are returning, welcome. It is an unusually busy day for the Senate or really the legislative off season today, because Chairman Hickman has a committee meeting across the street, along with Chairman Dixon as well. And so we are going to go ahead and get started on time, even though I do know we have a few other members that are still coming. Welcome to the Senate Special Committee on the Protection of Women's Sports. And I want to start, since we have met last, good morning, Chairman, since we've met last, there's been a trying time in South and Southeast Georgia. And want to extend a particular thanks to our Appropriations Chairman, Senator Blake Tillery, for making the trip up. And would like to turn the floor over to him for a couple of minutes just to talk about the recovery efforts in his area. And then he's going to open us up in a word of prayer for this committee. But specifically, Chairman, if you could say a word of prayer for your area as well, we would greatly appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, thank you to many of you who are out in the audience and those who are watching online, and also to our colleagues. The response of you individually has been tremendous, whether it be our colleagues in the House and Senate who have overwhelmingly loaded tractor trailers full of supplies being canned goods, generators, tarps. The folks who showed up with just their own personal trailer and a chainsaw, you don't know how uplifting that was. My friend has a 1/4 acre lot with 17 trees on it. They were not all his trees. It was just really a disaster. But, you know, we were very fortunate in that we still had homes. We still had businesses to go back to. Without power for 7 days, I got to give a huge shout out to the linemen. There were 2,300 in the 11 counties that I represent alone who came out on top of the others. And they, I hope they felt the love of our community. Some of the high school bands took in line the roads last week to just tell them thank you. You'd be amazed how far a thank you goes when you're working 17, 18, 19-hour days. Governor Kemp's response, he's been down through our district at least twice. Lieutenant Governor Jones, who's been through on 2 swings through. Appreciate all that they've done. There's still a lot to be done right now. If you're wondering what you can do, there are several websites that take donations. It's going to be a long-term recovery. It's not going to be something that happens over just a 3, 4, 5 week recovery. We're in week 3 already. It's hard to believe. Power's still not on in all places. So canned goods are very important because you can heat those up. And so canned goods are helpful. The dollars to help folks recover long-term are going to be helpful. But overall, I just want to say thank you so much for all that many of you have already done, particularly our colleagues, some of them that I only hear about when they have a budget request, who have gone out of their way to make themselves available to the folks who live in my community and our community. So thank you very much for all of your help. So.
If you would open a word of prayer.
Sure. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for giving us a nice warm building without leaks that we can come today and deliberate topics of importance to the citizens of Georgia. Lord, I ask you give us wisdom as we approach the task ahead, that we would listen before we speak, that we would make decisions that are wise for all those involved, including those who are going to come after us and will never know that we were here. In your name I pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Chairman. All right, we have a 2-pronged discussion this morning, and we have 4 people that are going to testify. The first 2 will essentially talk about the current legal climate around this issue around the country, what states have passed what laws, what the court challenges have been to those laws, what the court rulings or appeals have been therein. And then secondly, we have 2 people that are going to 2 doctors who are going to talk about some of the physical, medical, and competitive differences that we see between men and women in both the high school, collegiate, and professional sports levels. And then we have a limited amount of time. I saw a lot of people signed up over here. We have a limited amount of time for public comment, which is not on the agenda, but we will take public comment today. This is not a legislative hearing. So typically when we have committee hearings at the Capitol, we're discussing legislation, we will sometimes and oftentimes have public comment specific to that legislation. I believe that those of you that have signed up are here to offer your general viewpoints on the topic, which is perfectly fine. We will, due to the volume of names that I see on there, limit that time though, especially since we will very quickly lose a number of these other members to a different committee. If you were here last time, and you had thought you had signed up to speak, but did not sign up to speak, but you communicated through a lobbyist, I did not get that email that the lobbyist had sent because my admin had changed. And I was without an admin for a couple of weeks, in the off session, which is an okay time to be without an admin. But always in these committees, please make sure you sign up. So even if you think you've sent an email to someone that had told you that you will speak, and you think that person may have communicated with us, please go ahead and sign up on the sign up sheet. For those of you that were here though last time and were not able to share, I want to apologize for that, and we will offer you the first opportunity to speak today, just so that we can recognize that you've made 2 efforts to be here, and have your voice heard. So with that being said, for the 4 people they're on the agenda to testify, we'll have you individually come up to the center here, and I will turn your microphone on, and you will have 15 minutes each. Then the committee will have time to answer questions, or ask questions, I should say, that you will answer, and that will be our flow for this morning. So up first is Erica Steinmiller with the Center for Public Policy with the Alliance for Defending Freedom. Eric, thank you for being here this morning. I said Eric, I said Erica. Hopefully I said Erica. Thank you for being here this morning. If you could just introduce yourself to the committee, and then the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman Dolezal, and good morning, distinguished members of the committee. My name is Erica Steinmiller Perdomo, and I serve as legal counsel at Alliance Defending Freedom. Alliance Defending Freedom is the world's largest legal organization committed to advancing the God-given right to live and speak the truth in law, policy, and in the public square. We are one of the nation's most respected and successful United States Supreme Court advocates. We played various roles in 77 Supreme Court victories and achieved wins on behalf of pastors, churches, religious organizations, college students, pro-life pregnancy centers, and many others. We believe women and girls deserve a fair and level playing field. That's why we work to protect the health and safety of women and girls in state law and policy, like the Save Women's Sports Act. And we work with attorneys general and other state officials to defend these laws in court. For example, we're currently working with Idaho and West Virginia to defend their women's sports laws at the U.S. Supreme Court. ADF is involved in several other lawsuits on behalf of school districts and female athletes, challenging the Biden-Harris administration's unlawful rewrite of Title IX. And we've even supported Georgia's efforts, in which a recent victory at the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals prohibits the Biden administration from enforcing the rule against Georgia and several other states. I'm joined today by my colleague, Rachel Rouleau, who will talk more about our cases and ongoing litigation and tell you some of the stories of the girls we're fighting for. Female athletes like Selena Soule, Chelsea Mitchell, and Alana Smith, who've personally lost out on championships and other athletic opportunities to males who were allowed to compete in their sports. We also are joined by several experts who will speak to the physiological differences between men and women and the true risk to women and girls from having males compete in their sports. But first, I'd like to discuss why our laws, such as the Save Women's Sports Act, that has now passed in over half the country, must protect opportunities for girls in athletics by ensuring they're not forced to compete against males in their sports. Allowing males to compete in girls' sports destroys fair competition and deprives girls of medals, podium spots, and potential scholarships, not to mention the harassment they face in the locker rooms. For 50 years, under Title IX, women and girls have been guaranteed to have the same opportunities in education and athletics as men. But as this panel heard in the first special committee hearing, and as has been crystal clear from recent news, women competing at all levels, from grade school all the way to the Olympics, have been stripped of the protections of federal law by their schools and the athletic organizations that are governing their sports. Laws like the Save Women's Sports Act are designed to protect equal opportunities for girls in athletics by limiting girls' teams to females, by applying the law to females of all ages, including college, and by giving female athletes a legal remedy. These laws, which have passed in 25 states, all operate based on these 3 simple principles. So I'm just going to walk through them briefly. First, Sports teams in grade schools, high schools, and colleges and universities should be designated as either male, female, or co-ed. And second, males are not eligible to compete on the girls' teams. Why? Because males have a 10 to 50% performance advantage over girls, depending on the sport. Science and common sense tells us that men are generally bigger, faster, and stronger than females. They have larger hearts and lungs, denser bones, and stronger muscles. Men average around a 60 to 100% greater arm strength, 25 to 60% greater leg strength, and approximately 60% greater grip strength than women. In baseball and tennis, volleyball, men are able to throw, hit, and kick the ball faster and further than women. The world's best female Olympic athletes would lose to literally thousands of boys on any given day. In just 1 year, 275 high school boys ran faster times than the lifetime best of world champion sprinter Allison Felix. Biological sex is indisputably the biggest driver of athletic advantage. And that's true even from an early age. Even from the age of 6, boys display significant advantages in cardiovascular endurance, muscular strength, speed, agility, and power. And that's why our laws must establish that males are not eligible to participate in the female category in athletics from kindergarten to college. Sports teams have always utilized eligibility requirements based on biological facts to ensure fairness in sports. For example, we often separate teams based on age because an 18-year-old has significant athletic advantages over a 12-year-old. We create separate weight categories for sports like wrestling and boxing so that a 150-pound lightweight is not paired against a 250-pound heavyweight. In the same way, we've long separated teams based on sex because of the physiological differences between men and women. Sex is one of those physical, immutable characteristics that makes a difference in sports. Schools can use their existing processes like an annual sports physical eval that's signed by a licensed physician and which a school already has a duty to maintain as confidential in order to determine student eligibility. Such eligibility rules that state that men are not eligible for women's sports ensure fairness and safety on the playing field. The third principle that has been adopted by almost every state that has enacted a women's sports law is to ensure that women and girls have a legal remedy when their schools or sports teams fail to protect them. If a young woman is deprived of a podium spot or is kicked off a team because a male athlete takes her place, she should be able to have a legal remedy so that her right to play and win can be restored. But these laws also protect schools and colleges by giving them a legal remedy against the governing bodies that would attempt to punish them for protecting female athletes. In other words, these laws protect both athletes and the schools and colleges where they compete. As you well know, athletic organizations like the NCAA have punted on this issue, deferring to governing bodies of each individual sport to establish a patchwork of rules that leave some girls protected and other girls at risk. The NCAA doesn't have the best interest of Georgia's female athletes in mind. It's important for this body to step in where others have failed to protect the safety of women and girls. Georgia's women and girls deserve fairness on the playing field to make sure that a man's not taking their place. And they deserve fairness off the playing field to make sure that a man is not in their locker rooms. Georgia can and should protect girls from being exposed to males in their private spaces, like the NCAA championship swimmers experienced at Georgia Tech in 2022. Again, 25 states have already enacted Save Women's Sports laws to protect fairness in women's sports. None of those states has experienced any economic consequences for doing so. No lost NCAA tournaments or events, no boycotts, no businesses pulling out of their states. Georgia remains the only state in the Southeast and the SEC conference that has not acted to protect women's sports. Protecting fairness for women athletes fully aligns with the U.S. Constitution, with Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972, and with state law. Title IX prohibits sex discrimination in education, but it expressly permits separating sexes when it comes to bathrooms, living facilities, locker rooms, shower facilities, and sports teams. Federal courts, including the 11th Circuit, have acknowledged the reality that commingling of the biological sexes in the female athletics arena would significantly undermine the benefits that separate sports teams afford to female student athletes. And fairness on the playing field isn't just a matter of trophies and championships. Women's athletic opportunities are directly linked to their success later in life. Research shows that 94% of female executives played competitive sports, learning the importance of teamwork, of discipline, of resiliency and grit. Destroying women's opportunities for success in their sports will drastically change the landscape that women have fought for generations to achieve. Allowing males to compete in girls' sports reverses nearly 50 years of advances for women. It's time for Georgia to step up and ensure girls have a fair opportunity to compete and win. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you tell me, I was trying to keep up with a couple things you were saying. I think you outlined basically 3 pillars of what you're seeing that are common across the 25 states. I think you said that had enacted legislation. The third one, I'll go in reverse order because I think I caught these late. You said there's essentially legal remedies. Is that a cause of action? And how have you seen that play out, if you've seen that play out in any states?
So that's right. There would be a cause of action for girls who are harmed. They would be able to go to the courthouse if their school is not abiding by the laws. They would be able to go to the courthouse and ask for an injunction and the court would be asking the court essentially to require the schools to comply with the law. And it also protects the schools when athletic organizations are threatening to punish them for complying with the law. So the schools would be protected for complying with the Save Women's Sports law. And yeah, my colleague Rachel can talk more about some of the ongoing litigation, but essentially, yes, it would give girls a remedy that actually gives teeth to the law.
Correct. Can you tell me the 2 other things you highlighted? I think one was essentially kindergarten through university is where you're seeing these.
Yes, that's.
Are all 25 states dealing with that universally? Or are you seeing some variants where some states are only dealing with up until high school and they're silent on collegiate athletics, or what's the?
That's right. So some of the states have currently only enacted laws that protect from K through 12 arena, but the point of this law is to advance the protections of Title IX, to build upon the foundations of Title IX. Title IX covers all educational institutions from kindergarten through the college level that receive federal funding. And it really undermines the legitimacy of the law to say it only protects K through 12, because an 18-year-old girl who's competing as a senior in her high school is afforded protections that an 18-year-old girl competing as a college freshman does not receive. So in order to be able to give legitimacy and to fully protect all women and girls under the promise of Title IX, it should apply to the college level. So we've seen some states, for example, in Texas, they initially enacted just the K through 8 and then later worked to add protections for collegiate female athletes.
Great, thank you. Any other questions from the committee? All right, seeing none, thank you so much. We may call you back up at some point in the future, but Rachel Rouleau is joining you as well. Rachel, thank you for being here. If you can introduce yourself to the committee, and then the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much. I want to thank the chairman and the committee for inviting me to speak here today about efforts to protect fairness in women's sports in Georgia and across the country. I'm Rachel Rouleau. I also work at Alliance Defending Freedom and work on our conscience team and protecting the rights of women and girls to have an equal playing field in sports. Girls deserve to compete on a level playing field. And for years, Alliance Defending Freedom has been standing with female athletes who have been deprived of equal athletic opportunities because of policies that allow men to compete on women's sports. We filed the first women's sports case in 2020. We've provided our legal expertise on the issue to lawmakers across the country as they pass legislation to safeguard fairness for women and girls in their states. And we've seen the harm that occurs when states are left unprotected by legislation that ensures the women's category remains women only. For example, in our first women's sports case we filed in 2020 in Soule versus the Connecticut Connecticut Association of Schools. We're representing Selena Soul, Chelsea Mitchell, Alana Smith, and Ashley Nicoletti. And this case all started when Connecticut they enacted a policy that allowed men to compete on women's sports teams. And because of this policy, all 4 of our clients were forced to compete against 2 male athletes throughout all 4 years of high school. And these 2 male athletes broke 15 state records previously held by 9 different girls. They snatched 17 individual records that had previously been held by girls. And in total, girls lost 85 opportunities to compete in the next level of competition because of these 2 males that competed. Selena, Chelsea, Alana, and Ashley, they all lost out. They all lost out on different opportunities, but they lost out on state championships, chances to compete, college scholarship opportunities, and really the chance to be victorious in their own sports. And many of the girls said that the mere fact that they had to compete against 2 male athletes left them feeling demoralized and wondering why they were even competing when they knew that they weren't going to be able to come in first place, lining up at the start line. And these issues, the case is still going on in Connecticut, and these issues are still going on in Connecticut because the policy still is in place and still taking away opportunities from female athletes. And that's in a state that had a policy that allowed men to compete in women's sports. There are many other examples of women who are losing out on chances to compete across the country because of male participation. We also represent Maddie Kenyon and MK Marshall, who from Idaho who were forced to compete against a male athlete in track and field during college. Maddie Kenyon lost competitions to a male athlete 5 separate times. And she described how defeating it feels to lose to a male athlete. She sacrificed so much time to wake up early for practice every morning. She sacrificed and had to skip family and school events because she was working out and working with the team and couldn't even attend any parties because she couldn't stay out late. So she felt like her hard work really was pointless because she knew that she would never have an opportunity to beat this male athlete. After Idaho became the first state to pass a Save Women's Sports law in 2020, Maddie and MK stepped up to defend the law against a legal challenge by the ACLU. And in West Virginia, we saw a very similar story. West Virginia legislatures recognized the need for a women's sports law, and they passed it in 2021. Like Idaho's, it was immediately challenged by the ACLU on behalf of a male student. And this male athlete was permitted to compete on the girls' track and field team during the litigation. This athlete not only displaced his other teammates from the competition, but he also was allowed to have access to the girls' restroom and locker rooms. And the girls felt so uncomfortable changing in the locker room with this male athlete that many of them took extra time to change in a stall before practice or before games. And there's not a lot of stalls available to girls, so it took a lot of time. And some of them didn't have the opportunity to have extra privacy. But not only did this male really go into their private spaces, but he also began to sexually harass his female teammates in the locker room and out on the track. Thankfully, in this case, we saw our first victory in women's sports. Initially, when the ACLU brought this suit, the district court ruled and granted the preliminary injunction that allowed that male to compete on the team and have access to those private spaces. But after hearing evidence from our experts about the physiological differences, the district court judge reversed. And so you're going to be able to hear from 2 of our experts in that case this morning. And the district court in that case ruled in our favor and declared that West Virginia's Save Women's Sports law was constitutional and consistent with Title IX. But the threat to women's fairness, the threats to fairness in women's sports are not just coming from groups like the ACLU. Like Erica mentioned earlier, and the largest threat is coming from the Biden-Harris administration and its efforts to push radical gender ideology on every state and every school in the country. Fortunately, women athletes are demonstrating incredible courage and leadership and are stepping up to push back against the Biden-Harris administration's efforts to erase women from their own sports. And ADF is representing Adalea Cross in these challenges. Adalea was one of the girls who was forced to compete with a male athlete in West Virginia. She was displaced from shot put and discus events that she had previously been able to compete at the next level of competition, but this male athlete took her position in that. But even more than that, she was one of the students that was forced to change in the same locker room and restroom. She felt so uncomfortable. She changed in a stall, and she was subjected to most of the sexually vulgar statements from this male, both in her, not only out on the track, but in her private locker room changing spaces, she was subjected to some of these comments, which is just even more egregious. We are representing Atalaya in challenging the Biden administration's efforts to redefine sex to include gender and identity in Title IX. And these Title IX changes wouldn't just threaten women's sports, but they will also allow men in women's most private spaces, like their locker rooms, restrooms, and even hotel rooms on overnight trips when the team travels together. We're also representing in these challenges Katie Rowland, who is a middle school student in Oklahoma. And her former school allowed males to use the girls' restroom before they passed their own bathroom law. And after encountering males in her restroom several times, she decided it really wasn't worth using the restroom at school anymore. And so she decided that she would wait until she got home after school. Sometimes she would wait up to 9 hours a day to use the restroom because she felt so uncomfortable using the bathroom with a male. She felt unsafe and vulnerable using the same restroom as a boy, and the administration really made it feel like this was a normal occurrence that she would have to endure. Atalaya and Katie are just, they got involved in these cases because they have seen the damage that's caused when males are allowed access to women's private spaces. And these are just two of the clients that we're representing against the Biden administration's Title IX changes. ADF filed 5 lawsuits against these changes, and we have received preliminary injunctions in all 5 of those cases. Like I said, we represent Atalaya Cross and then Christian Educators, which is an association of teachers. And we joined 6 states in challenging the Title IX rule changes, and that was filed in Tennessee. We also joined 6 states in Missouri, where we represent a high school female athlete who wants to compete on a level playing field. We represent Katie Rowland, like I discussed, and also Female Athletes United, which is a advocacy group for female athletes. And we joined 4 states and challenging the rules that was filed in Kansas. And then our last 2 cases, we represent a Texas school district and a Louisiana school district that was challenging those rules. But Atalaya and Katie's stories are really just an illustration of what could happen across the country if the Biden administration's Title IX changes are allowed to stand. And thankfully, there are 25 states, there's 26 states and thousands of schools across the country that are protected from these unlawful changes through the preliminary injunctions. The Department of Education appealed many of these injunctions, and 2 of those appeals made it all the way up to the Supreme Court. But thankfully, the Supreme Court has ruled to keep our injunctions in place while the litigation continues at the lower level. 4 of those 26 states are in the 11th Circuit, and that Erica discussed, where the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals granted a preliminary injunction while the litigation continues. Alabama, Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina. And 4 private organizations sued the Biden administration for these Title IX changes. The district court originally denied their preliminary injunction, but that was appealed. They received an administrative injunction. And then once there was further briefing, they were able to receive a preliminary injunction. And so we're very thankful that those 4 states, along with the other 22 states, have these protections in place while litigation continues. Again, like Erica said, we have 2 of our women's sports cases waiting at the U.S. Supreme Court, the Idaho case and the West Virginia case that I spoke about our clients a little bit earlier. And we're very hopeful that the court will take that case and uphold the Save Women's Sports laws. Because these women's sports laws should be upheld and protected. States have an interest in ensuring that women and girls have equal opportunities to compete and can compete on a level playing field. Laws can draw distinctions between males and females when they serve an important government interest, and there is no question that promoting equal opportunities for women is legitimate and important, and an important government interest. The Supreme Court allows for these differences between the sexes to be recognized. And the Title IX rule changes put forth by the Biden and Harris administration are unconstitutional, and they should be struck down. The rule changes, they unlawfully transformed Title IX from a statute ensuring equal educational opportunities for women and men to a statute that mandates preferences for gender ideology. And Title IX forbids treating one sex worse than the other. And the rule itself shows, the Title IX rule itself shows that sex distinctions are necessary to accomplish the goal that Title IX set out to do, which was to create more educational opportunities for women. And not only are the changes unconstitutional that they're trying to put in place, but they also conflict with the 25 states that have passed Save Women's Sports laws across the country. And the states that have passed these laws have an interest in continuing to enforce their own statutes. And it's not just important that women and girls have a level playing field in sports. It really goes beyond sports. Girls cannot play on an equal playing field if they're forced to change in a locker room or a restroom with a male before the game even starts. Girls and women deserve to be protected, and we're very grateful that this committee has seen the importance of protecting women and girls' opportunities to fair competition, safety, and privacy. Thank you.
Thank you. Got a couple questions for you.
Yeah.
Tell me why you think that the Title IX changes by the Biden administration are unconstitutional.
Well, they're unconstitutional because the Title IX changes, when they were originally enacted over 50 years ago, it was to create equal opportunities for women and girls. And we have seen, even in when I was describing why the Save Women's Sports laws are constitutional, the Supreme Court has ruled several times that having equal sports for women and men is an important government interest. And really what this is going to do is it really redefines what sex is to create redefine sex to include gender identity. And that was not the purpose of the Title IX changes when they were originally enacted. And so by forcing this new definition on the word sex without the power of Congress to do so is really completely gutting women's equal opportunities for women and girls and their privacy and safety. So it's really going around Congress by entirely changing what the rule was set out to do.
So if Congress were to enact a change to Title IX that recognized gender identity, you believe that would be constitutional?
I don't believe that would be constitutional, but it wouldn't violate the Administrative Procedures Act and things of that nature. But I don't believe that it would be constitutional to eliminate these equal playing fields that women and girls have, because the entire purpose of it was to create that. And the Supreme Court has ruled over and over again that it is a legitimate and important interest to give women and girls an equal opportunity.
Okay. I'm going to push you a little bit on that though, Counselor. Why would it be unconstitutional for Congress to enact a law that would recognize gender identity under Title IX?
Well, maybe it wouldn't be unconstitutional. We would still obviously oppose that because we want to create an equal opportunity for women and girls. But we can also provide you further information on that too, if I'm not adequately answering your question.
So to zoom out a little bit, tell me specifically, what did Title IX do for women's sports? What was it obviously had it was a narrow scope. I believe it was one word of Title IX that essentially grabs athletics. But what was the state of play before and what is the state of play after as a result of Title IX?
Yeah, I'd be happy to address that. So when Title IX was originally passed, it was to create equal opportunities in education. And then with some amendments afterwards, it also was applied to create equal opportunities in sports as well. And so before Title IX was passed, there were about 300,000 women, I'd say nationally, that were competing in women's sports. And now over 50 years later, there are over 3 million women and girls competing in sports. And that's a huge growth. Women have had the opportunities not just to compete in women's sports, but like many of our clients, they've pushed through and been able to access more opportunities through college scholarships, public recognition, a lot of opportunities because they've competed in sports. And many of them have actually said, if I wasn't involved in sports, I probably wouldn't have been able to go to college because I wouldn't have been able to afford it. And so there's a lot of things that Title IX has given the women the opportunities to do. And even like Erica said, sports is an indication of greater success later in life, as 94% of women who are in higher levels of leadership in different corporations all competed at sports at young ages, so they could have more. It just gives them more opportunities to really develop leadership and those types of skills that help them later in life.
You said something to start, I think this somewhat new information for this committee. You mentioned a Connecticut law, which essentially is if I understand this correctly, the opposite of the laws that you are advocating for. Tell me what the Connecticut law did.
So the Connecticut law allows males in, I believe it's K through 12, to compete on women's sports, basically redefined sex to include gender identity. Students were allowed to compete according to their gender identity, whatever sports team that was. And so what happened in Connecticut is that 2 males were allowed to compete on the women's team. First, there was a male that entered the track and field team and took all of these different accolades. Actually, one of the males was competing on the men's team. And then over the winter break, those 2 weeks in between, began identifying as a female and then started competing on the female team. And so these 2 male athletes, like I said, took away so many different records. I believe it was 15 records that were held by 9 women just in a few years. And one of our female athletes, Chelsea Mitchell, she lost 4 state championship titles to 2 of these males. She came even either in second, third, or wasn't able to even compete because only the top 2 in some of these regions are allowed to continue competing in these.
Is there a nexus in the Connecticut law between gender identity and the ability for a male to participate on a women's sports team, or is any male allowed to participate on a women's sports
I
team?
believe there is a nexus between the identification of the gender identity. Because which also just shows the distinctions here, because we do not allow males. I believe that law would not allow males that identify as men to compete on the women's team, but it does allow males who identify as women to compete on the team. And that just shows that there is actual sex discrimination even between males in that law.
Gotcha. Are there any other states that have enacted similar legislation?
I believe there are other states, yes, and like Washington and some of these other states, but there are most of the states, I think, either just don't have a law on either side. So I think that law in Connecticut really just is a perfect demonstration and example of what can happen in other states that don't have these protections. And then even in West Virginia, that one male athlete that I spoke about that was allowed to compete has displaced almost 300 girls just in a 3-year span. And that was just the one male athlete that was allowed to compete on the women's team. And that just shows what an impact having one male athlete compete can do, just not only displacing that many women, but also the privacy aspect and the sexual harassing comments to different girls just really shows what could happen across the country if these laws aren't put in place.
Thank you. Any other questions from the committee? All right. Thank you for being here
Thank you very
today.
much.
All right. Next up, we have Dr. Chad Carlson. Doctor, thank you for being here today. If you would, introduce yourself to the committee, and then the floor is yours.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, it's a pleasure to be here before you today as you consider the merits of new legislation to protect women's athletics in the state of Georgia. My name is Chad Carlson. I'm a board-certified physician in sports medicine. For the last 18 years, I've been in private practice in Des Moines, Iowa. I have fellow status through the American College of Sports Medicine, as well as our specialties National Academy, the American Medical Society for Sports Medicine. I serve on ACSM's Health and Science Policy Committee, served 2 elected terms on the American Medical Society for Sports Medicine's Board of Directors, as well as 2 elected terms on that organization's executive committee. Starting in 2019, I also had the privilege of serving as AMSSM's 26th president. The perspective that I'm bringing to you today is that of a clinician who deals with athletes and athletic injury care on a daily basis. Because of my time in leadership, I also carry the perspective of some of the non-medical influences at play that impact organizational decision-making around issues such as the one you are all considering today. When it comes to the transgender athlete, even within the academy, ideology often seems to trump science. Coming as I do from Iowa, I'd be remiss not to remind the committee that Caitlin Clark is now arguably the figurehead of an era where women's athletics are gaining increasingly national recognition and demonstrating the ability to generate revenue on their own. From the inception of Title IX in 1972, the growth of women's sports has been phenomenal. As opportunities for women in sport increase, it's imperative that the environment that they compete in remain their own. Fairness in sport promotes participation in sport. Participation in sport and its intangibles benefit society. The state needs to intervene to ensure safety and competitive equity for female athletes because in the current sociopolitical climate, organizations that provide regulatory authority in sport cannot be relied on to make consistent decisions with women's interests at the forefront. The transgender policies of many organizations are fluid and sometimes arbitrarily applied. I'll speak briefly to 2 examples of this, looking at the International Olympic Committee and then the NCAA. The IOC first developed regulations around the transgender athlete in 2003, requiring gender reassignment surgery, institution of appropriate hormone therapy, and a 2-year waiting period following surgery before an athlete could compete in another sex category. In 2015, the IOC revisited this policy, dropping the requirement for surgery, binding an athlete to their choice of gender for a minimum of 4 years, and in the case of men who identify as women, maintaining a serum testosterone level of less than 10, starting 12 months prior to competition, and continuing while in competitive elite sports, subject to periodic testing. Serum testosterone in men and women is bimodal and non-overlapping, with men almost never dropping below 8 nanomoles per liter and women almost never rising above 2. So an allowable threshold of 10 for men wanting to compete as females in sport was around 5 times greater than the upper limit for biological females. And although the stated goal of the guidelines was the guarantee of fair competition, the 2015 IOC policy as codified was in need of revision from the very beginning. In 2021, the IOC finally revised their policy, but rather than require male athletes who identify as women to conform to testosterone levels in the female range, they instead completely changed the goal of their stated guidelines from competitive equity to non-discrimination and inclusion. Abandoning any effort at self-regulation, the IOC instead called on international sports governing bodies to formulate their own sport-specific policies, respecting the principles embedded in the IOC framework. In this framework, the IOC cited 10 principles that governing bodies were to consider in the formulation of their policies. These were not science-based goals. One principle was that no transgender athlete should be presumed to have a competitive advantage. Another, regulating the creation of evidence-based approaches, required any restrictions to be grounded in research that demonstrates a consistent, unfair, and disproportionate competitive advantage or an unpreventable risk to the physical safety of other athletes. This data is supposed to come from athletes in the specific sport the organization is seeking to regulate. Given the innate performance differences between men and women, a competitive advantage has to be assumed. Moreover, since the absolute numbers of elite transgender athletes are small, it is virtually impossible to develop empirical research that meets the goals of the IOC. Since the creation of the IOC framework in 2021, international sports governing bodies have attempted to respond with the development of sport-specific guidelines that are now quite variable in their application and not always intuitively matched to the needs of the specific sport. The authors of the IOC statement have also shown themselves to be somewhat tone-deaf, stating that eligibility criteria for competition should only exist in the context of elite competition, suggesting that breaches of competitive equity are okay and create no victims as long as the contest is not a world-class event. The NCAA codified a policy on the transgender athlete in 2010, requiring male athletes who identify as women to have completed 1 year of testosterone suppression before being allowed to compete against biological females. There was never any formalized program to monitor compliance, nor was there any tracking of injury rates related to participation of biological males in women's sports. In January 2022, following quickly on the heels of the IOC's policy update, the NCAA announced a phased update to their own transgender policy. This new policy is supposed to require athletes to conform to the policies of their national governing bodies, or if no national governing body standard exists, the policy of the international governing body, or finally, the 2015 IOC standards. Unsurprisingly, the implementation of the NCAA policy has been arbitrary and inconsistent as well. As I move into an overview of some of the relevant clinical issues involved with the crossover of men into women's sports, let me start by saying that in considering legislation to protect the female category in sport, you are seeking to regulate the obvious. The fact that men are able to athletically outperform women is not controversial to most people, and rightly so. It's important to point out, however, that even though injury risk is more difficult to quantify, allowing biological men to compete in women's sports does put women at some level of increased risk for injury. Pooled data suggests that 1 year of testosterone suppression only results in about 5% loss of pre-transition muscle mass. This illustrates the fact that it is not so much a given testosterone level, but developmental exposure to male levels of testosterone that confers advantage. In 2021, the UK Sports Council's Equality Group looked at this issue formally and noted a lack of consensus on any workable solution, as well as concerns related to athlete safety and adherence to rules which give sport validity. Although I don't believe that serum testosterone is the only determinant of the enhanced male performance in sport, there is no doubt that it is the major one. Males who have undergone male puberty have categorically greater lean body mass, greater height, and thus longer limbs, higher bone mineral density, greater strength and power, greater speed, and enhanced delivery of oxygen to working muscle. Research shows that on average, during the prime athletic years, men have, on average, 54% greater total muscle mass than women, including 64% greater muscle mass in the upper body and 47% greater in the lower body. My report that was provided to you references all of this in more detail, but I want to state that no one of these variables exists in isolation. Some policymakers question why a given male who identifies as a female, who may weigh less than a given biological woman, ought not to be allowed to compete in the female category. This is where categorical differences come into play. A biological male is categorically different than a biological female in the aggregate. For purposes of sport competition, men and women exist in different pools. Female injury risk in a given sport is a known quantity. That is, given variability of a female body type and the interplay of these body types in the context of sport, a defined injury rate per athletic exposure exists. The risk is predictable and defined, and risk assumption is implied when a woman participates in a given sport. When a biological male competes with biological women, however, you are introducing an individual that is categorically different in the aggregate, and injury risk is going to shift upward. This was the basis for the recommendations of World Rugby to ban biological males from competing in the women's category in 2020. Another important point to make is that these multiple categorical differences can and often do lead to exponentially greater differences in abilities. I'll give you two examples. First, using their legs, torso, and arms for power generation, men can apply substantially larger forces with their arms and upper body, enabling them to generate more pushing or punching power. Isolated sex-specific differences in muscle strength in one region, even differences that in isolation can seem small, can and do combine to generate even greater sex-specific differences in more complex sport-specific functions. One study looking at moderately trained individuals found that males can generate 162% more punching power than females. Piggybacking on this, research shows that male volleyball players have higher vertical jumps than their female counterparts, in part by utilizing greater lower body power. The greater leg strength and jumping ability of men confer a further large advantage in volleyball that is relevant to injury risk. In volleyball, an attack jump is a jump to position a player to spike the ball downward over the net against the opposing team. Research on elite national volleyball players found that on average, males exhibited a 50% greater vertical jump height during an attack than did females. Men serve and spike volleyballs with higher velocity than women, with a performance advantage in the range of 29 to 34%. Analysis of first and second tier Belgian national elite male volleyball players shows ball spike speeds of 63 miles per hour and 56 miles per hour, respectively. NCAA Division I female volleyball players, roughly comparable to the second tier male elite group referenced above, average a ball spike velocity of approximately 40 miles per hour. Notably, male spiking speed in lower elite divisions is almost 40% greater than that of NCAA Division I female collegiate players. There's an almost 30% advantage in maximal serve velocity in men. Kinetic energy is dependent on mass and the square of velocity. A volleyball with fixed mass struck by a male and traveling an average 35% faster than one struck by a female will deliver 82% more energy to a head upon impact. Also consider that the woman's net height is 7 inches lower than that used in men's volleyball. The combination of the innate male-female differences cited above, along with the lower net height in women's volleyball, means that if a reasonably athletic male is permitted to compete against women, the participating female players will likely be exposed to higher ball velocities that are outside the range of what is typically seen in women's volleyball. There are safety implications to this, and to my knowledge, the NCAA, again, does not track injuries related to the participation of males in female sport. Although most research indicates that men who are attempting to medically transition towards a more female body type fall somewhere between biological women and biological men in measures of sports performance, it is also important to keep in mind that in the context of competitive sport, intentional training techniques can in part mitigate the loss of lean muscle mass and strength, even when testosterone levels are dramatically suppressed. In addition to this, athletes who have entered male puberty and its accompanying testosterone surge develop an enhanced tendency for training-induced muscle hypertrophy that persists to some degree even after gender-affirming hormone therapy is instituted. For this reason, some international governing bodies, World Rugby, World Aquatics, and World Athletics, to name a few, now permanently ban any male from women's competition after they have entered into male puberty. I began my remarks by stating that it is incumbent on the state to institute legal protections for female athletes. Bringing this back to the 2022 NCAA swimming championships at Georgia Tech that led to the current lawsuit. In 2020, the NCAA convened a summit on gender identity and student athlete participation. Through my position on AMSM's executive committee, I designated a member to sit on the steering committee of this group. The group used what's called a modified Delphi process to try to bring consensus to issues surrounding the transgender athlete, looking at the utility and feasibility of different suggested policy standards. Generally, when a Delphi process is undertaken, there's a wide diversity of viewpoints that becomes more coalesced over successive rounds of clarifying questions. But the NCAA's process expressly excluded any groups who advocated against allowing biological males to participate in women's sports. Not surprisingly, they had almost complete agreement on whether the strategies that were identified through the first round of questions had utility or were feasible. This high level of early agreement tells you that the NCAA did a poor job of fostering open dialogue. Ultimately, of the 17 policy strategies assessed, only 2 were designated as unfeasible, but 1 was ensuring availability of gender-safe facilities for locker rooms and restrooms. Why should the Georgia legislature act to protect women in sport? Well, the NCAA went to all this trouble to assess future problems in 2020 and then didn't consider the findings of their own summit with respect to student safety in bathrooms at the championship event at Georgia Tech. So I would encourage you not to count on outside groups with ideological constraints to make the proper decisions, but to institute the policy that you think will best serve to promote competitive fairness and safety for women's athletics in Georgia. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Doctor. And as the doctor referenced, he has provided additional information that I have in the committee folders that you can review as well. Are there questions, Chairman Hickman?
Thank you, Doctor, for being here. Let's just take an example. Let's take a 18-year-old male and an 18-year-old female and compete. Tell me what it's going to take the 18-year-old, how many years it's going to take the 18-year-old male to equal the female or the female to equal the male in order for them to bring them equal. That's kind of what it's all about, isn't it?
Years of what, Chairman? You asking about years of hormone therapy?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes. Years
I'll
of
clarify
hormone.
that.
Yeah, because I think what we're talking about, these puberty blockers are just like a few months or something like that. Tell me how long you think, in your professional opinion, it's going to take one to equal the other.
Well, the honest answer to that is that the answer to that doesn't exist. However, what we do know is that that 18-year-old male will never settle down towards complete similarity with that female. The data going out to 4 years or more shows, as I said, loss of muscle mass of around 5% or so. And when you consider the differences between men and women in terms of muscle mass when they start, that still confers a large competitive advantage. The other thing to say is that, again, training, most of the research looking at changes in body composition are done in non-athletes. And again, somebody who is intentionally trying to build a body for competition can utilize training techniques while they're on hormone therapy to mitigate some of the loss as well. And there's decent evidence that can occur. But when you look at, for instance, the swimmer at Georgia Tech, who was middle range in terms of his placement on the men's teams the first 2 years he was competing, and then was winning NCAA championships when he converted over to a female category.
So in your professional opinion, they will never be equal?
No, you cannot medically transition a male to a female.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Dixon.
Yes, thank you, doctor, for coming today. I've just had a question. When you mentioned testosterone levels, naturally for a woman, it never went above a 0.2, I believe is what you said, or a 2.
1.8
One-
to would be
okay.
the upper limit.
And you
um,
mentioned one state allowed a biological male to compete if their testosterone level was down to a point or a 1 or a 10 or something like that.
Can you repeat that?
One state you mentioned that once a male's testosterone level dropped to a 10,
The IOC's
Right.
initial policy was for a threshold of 10, yes.
is there a way, I guess if a woman's natural is around a 1.8 or a 2, for her to go up to a 10, or would that be considered doping?
That would be considered doping. It's interesting that individuals with disorders of sex development, that some of those conditions result in a woman in a person who's woman by appearance, but has high levels of androgen, or sometimes in these individuals, their natural testosterone levels can run up into the upper 2s, and there is assumed to be an advantage, a competitive advantage, even to that small bump in testosterone, because when you look at the percentage of these types of individuals that exist in the elite athlete population relative to the general population, it's much higher. So they're overrepresented. So the idea that you can have a competitive advantage with a very small change in testosterone relative to female norms stands in stark opposition to, or contrast, I should say, to the IOC's initial threshold of 10, or even lower limits of 5.
Thank you.
Any other questions for the committee? Thank you, doctor, for being here today, and stand by in case we have any follow-up with you. All right, next up, I believe joining us via Zoom. Sydney, if we have Dr. Greg Brown. Dr. Brown, are you with us? We're about to unmute you, I think.
Okay, I'm here. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, doctor. Are you, you are from the University of Nebraska Department of Kinesiology and Sports Science. If you can introduce yourself to the committee, and then the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. So my name is Greg Brown. I'm a professor of exercise science in the Department of Kinesiology and Sports Sciences at the University of Nebraska at Kearney. I think you all should have a copy of my expert report that I've put together that sets forth all of my qualifications and everything. So rather than bore you with all those details, I'll just refer to that. Am I able to share my screen on this Zoom?
Yes.
All right. All right. Sorry, problems. There we go. All right. So you should also have a copy of this PowerPoint and also a list of sources I cited and referred to as I prepared this PowerPoint. I think as you look at my expert report, if you look at that, you'll notice that I was on faculty at Georgia Southern University from 2002 to 2004. And so my family has many fond memories of living in Statesboro and enjoying Southeast Georgia, such as Magnolia Springs State Park, Savannah, Tybee Island. And I really appreciate the comments at the beginning of this meeting and the prayer and the thoughts for those in Southeast Georgia. I've got friends still in Statesboro that I keep track of, and we've kind of been vicariously experiencing the challenges they've had with loss of power and challenges with clean water and stuff. So I appreciate the concern of the Georgia Senate to take care of those folks. Something not included in my expert report is that my son completed Army National Guard basic training and infantry training at Fort Benning, Georgia. And he actually has fond memories of his time at Fort Benning, which is surprising for somebody from basic training and infantry training. I think you all know from your own personal experience and from what you've heard today that men can lift heavier weights, throw farther and faster, jump higher and farther, run faster, swim faster, etc., than similarly aged, trained, and talented females. In my report, I summarized just the overwhelming amount of evidence, including an immense number of scientific studies showing that after the onset of puberty, males have inherent biologically based athletic advantages when compared to similarly aged, trained, and talented females. Anyone who says that men are not bigger, faster, and stronger than women is being disingenuous. My report also sets forth the evidence that reducing testosterone concentrations in men does not erase the male athletic advantages when compared to similarly aged, trained, and talented females. And so today, what I want to focus on are the male sex-based athletic advantages before the onset of puberty. Now, you may have heard there are not differences in athletic performance between boys and girls before puberty, but I'm here to provide evidence that even before puberty, boys have athletic advantages when compared to similarly aged, trained, and talented girls. So we talk about puberty. And so one of the things, puberty typically starts about age 10 for girls, somewhere around, 8 to 14 years old, and about age 11 and a half in boys, range 9 to 14 years old. Puberty can be, quantified through what are called the Tanner stages. Tanner stage 1 is a child who's pre-pubertal. Tanner stage 2 is when puberty starts, and there are specific measurements and stuff that can be made for that. And then you move through Tanner stage 3 and 4, and then Tanner stage 5 is when someone is, from a sexual reproduction standpoint, mature. One of the things I want to point out looking at this is school-based fitness testing, which we've all done, whether it was FitnessGram or the President's Fitness Test or something like that. The results from that type of testing shows that boys outperform girls on tests of muscular strength, muscular endurance, speed, power. So whether that's the number of push-ups in 30 seconds or the number of sit-ups in 30 seconds, or bent arm hang time, pull-ups, running a shuttle run, running the mile, those types of things, boys are outperforming girls even before puberty. Girls outperform boys on tests of flexibility, which typically would do the sit and reach, but there's other tests like that. And this stuff has been documented as young as 3 years old in children. Now, we know that physical fitness, we don't line the athletes up at the beginning of the event to see who can do the most push-ups, then give them the medals, or see who has the highest VO2 max. But we do know that improved physical fitness enhances athletic performance. That's why athletes spend so much time in the gym. This is just an example of data from one particular study. It's a great study. It's 2.8 million fitness tests in Europe in 30 different countries. And across those countries and across the tests, the boys at 9 years old and 10 years old, which we could pretty well assume is pre-puberty, it's a good reasonable assumption, they're outperforming the girls in standing broad jump by 8%. They're outperforming the girls in hand grip strength by 10 to 12%. Sit-ups, kind of interesting, no difference at 9 years old, but at 10 years old, there's an 11% difference. If you look at the bent arm hang time, over a 30% male advantage before puberty in bent arm hang time. 5%, 4% advantage in shuttle runs. The 20-meter shuttle run, the boys were doing 25 to 26% more minutes. And on the sit and reach, the girls were outperforming the boys by 18 to 22%. And again, that's from one particular study. But if you look at the sources cited, there's about 24 different studies I cite indicating that these differences exist, that boys are stronger and faster and more powerful than girls even before puberty. And these sex-based differences, they're consistent across countries and have been for the past 4 or 5 decades. That's very important because you'll hear people say that the sex-based differences before puberty are dependent on culture. But when you look at the number of different states and countries that have been studied in this, consistently showing that boys are outperforming girls in these physical fitness tests of strength, of power, of speed, of endurance, it cuts across so many different cultures. And again, these differences have been consistent for the past 4 to 5 decades. So even though we've seen immense improvements in the number of girls able to participate and that are participating in competitive sports, there are still sex-based differences in physical fitness, which that would imply that it's not a cultural factor, but instead more of a biological factor. And I've got some information here. This is from the 2024 USA Track and Field Georgia Association Junior Track and Field Championships. All right. And I just took the times and distances for the boys and times and distances for the girls for the 8 and under age group, which is the youngest age group USA Track and Field has. And if these children competed against one another, you'll see that none of the girls would have gotten a gold medal in 100, 200, 400, 800, 15-meter runs, 1500-meter runs, the shot put, the javelin, or long jump. 2 girls would have gotten a silver medal in the 1500 and the shot put, and 3 girls would have gotten bronze in 800-meter, 1500-meter, and long jump. So out of, what do we have there? 24 possible medals. Girls would have gotten 6, and none of them gold medal, which again would demonstrate when you have competitive athletes that are pre-puberty competing, boys still have advantages. Now, I recognize again that this is just a snapshot from one particular event, one particular track meet. So some colleagues and I, what we did is we took the 8 finalists in USA Track and Field National Junior Olympic Championships and National Championships. So they hold those events each year. So there's 2 national level competitions each year. Typically one is held more West Coast, one is held more East Coast to get distribution across the United States. So over the course of 7 years, with 2 different track meets each year, we looked at the fastest boys and the fastest girls. And if you took the averages in the 100, 200, 400, 800, or 1500 meter run, the boys were faster than girls by about 3 to 7% faster than girls. If you took the fastest boys compared to the fastest girls, again, the boys were faster than the girls. And so again, this is a scientific evaluation with the statistics and everything, demonstrating that even before puberty, in the 8 and under age group and the 9 to 10-year-old age group, boys are running faster than girls in elite level competition. And if you just kind of want to see what the data looks like, this next slide is just showing, you've got the white is the boys' times, the squares represent the 9 to 10-year-old, the circles are the 8 and under, and then the yellow is the girls. And you can see very clearly, you can see down there, I put the effect size. Effect size is a way of quantifying it. These are very large effect sizes. It doesn't take statistics really to look at this and say, okay, yeah, the boys were faster than the girls. The 9 to 10-year-old boys were faster than 9 to 10-year-old girls. The fastest boys faster than the fastest girl. Looking not just at my particular study, but looking at the studies that have been done at this. And there are not a lot of studies that have looked at athletic performance before puberty because, well, we've always looked at athletic performance before puberty as recreational and developmental. And you can't go down to your local elementary school and find the records for the fastest boy or fastest girl. Those types of things aren't available because of the developmental aspect of it. But with the current concerns for allowing males to compete in female sports, it's important to note that even before puberty, on average, boys are 3 to 7% faster than girls, and the fastest boys are faster than the fastest girls. If we look at swimming, the difference is smaller. It's about a 1 to 3% male advantage compared to females, but still, we still see this pattern of a male advantage. If we look at jumping and throwing, it's about a 7% advantage in jumping. We look at throwing in something like the javelin or shot put, it may be upwards of 20 to 30% male advantage before puberty. Now, generally speaking, these male advantages before puberty are smaller than after puberty. As Dr. Carlson said, testosterone really accelerates those advantages. Testosterone, we know it causes increase in muscle strength and size, which are advantageous for sports performance. But again, there's something about being a male before puberty that gives you athletic advantages compared to an equally age, trained, and talented female. And so it's important to note that female athletes, they're not just smaller, less muscular males. There are biological differences between males and females before puberty and after puberty. And the research I've looked at, the research I've conducted indicates that the differences in athletic performance are present before the onset of puberty. Now, a question comes up, what about puberty blockers? And it's an important thing to say that there's just not a lot of research on puberty blockers and athletic performance. I'm aware of one study looking at the effects of puberty blockers on hand grip strength that shows that even on puberty blockers, the boys are gaining hand grip strength more than similarly aged girls, which kind of goes along with puberty development. So it may not all just be suppressing the testosterone, all right? So there's no published research showing that puberty blockers erase male athletic advantages. And the research that exists shows that puberty blockers do not erase male advantages in body height, lean body mass, or muscle strength. And I thank you for your time. I'll stop my screen share here, and I'm open for questions.
Thank you, Doctor. Any questions from the committee? Doctor, I have one question, and and within the last probably 2 minutes, you made a statement that you essentially said, I don't know exactly how you said it. So I'm not going to try to put words in your mouth. Is there science around the reasons for this data that you're seeing? And has there been research done as to the reasons? I believe that what you said is generally we see what the trend lines are. Even before puberty, your data shows that male athletes are performing at a higher level relative to female athletes. And if not for the testosterone that comes during puberty, what is the cause of that?
So that is a really interesting question, is what is the cause of it? Is it simply because of the Y chromosome? Is there something with the Y chromosome and the genes that brings that gives males inherent abilities to have more muscle mass, more muscle strength? Is it possibly the effects of mini puberty? During the first 6 months after birth, boys experience much higher testosterone levels than girls, and they call that mini puberty. Is it something about that dose of testosterone the first 6 months that sets boys on a growth trajectory to have more muscle mass than girls? Those are speculative right now. It's not completely clear. There is research showing that before puberty, boys have about 10% more lean body mass than girls. And lean body mass is a major driver of athletic performance. It's a major driver of the differences in athletic performance between adults, and we know that. And so it makes sense that if before puberty boys have about 10% more lean body mass, that would be advantageous. Before puberty, even at age 8, you can see differences in the structure of the pelvis between boys and girls. The girls are going to have, it's not the full-blown developmental pelvis able to give childbirth, but it's trending in that direction, which actually gives girls a disadvantage in terms of what's called the Q angle, the angle basically between the hip and the knees, makes them a little less efficient for running, makes them a little less efficient for jumping. And so boys having a more narrow type of pelvis would give advantages there. There's also information indicating that even before puberty, even at birth, boys have larger lungs, they have greater numbers of alveoli, greater perfusion of the alveoli with blood vessels, and boys have slightly larger hearts even before puberty. And again, those are all factors that we see magnified by puberty, and we can see all those factors, and really lots of research demonstrating in adults, those are factors that give males inherent athletic advantages. And we see, again, those differences before puberty are smaller than after puberty, but they're still there. So it does seem that there's something inherent with being male, and again, whether it's the Y chromosome or whether it's mini puberty, that puts boys on a trajectory to have athletic advantages.
Thank you, Chairman Dixon.
Dr. Brown, I just had a question about the puberty blockers. Have y'all found any, or has there been any research finding any negative side effects for male or females using those for prolonged periods of time?
So there are a lot of questions on puberty blockers, whether they are safe, whether they're effective. I do want to say this is not my own original research. This is reading other studies on puberty blockers. There are concerns about during puberty, you see immense amounts of mental development. And there are concerns that puberty blockers stopping normal puberty are going to impair that mental development. It hasn't been evaluated. I can think of one study, it's a case study of a child on puberty blockers, and they see impairment in IQ. And that could be because of the puberty blockers. But again, that's one single case study on that. So that's a big concern is, if you do that with hundreds or thousands of children, what's happening? There are concerns of how puberty blockers are going to affect bone development, because during puberty, we see a lot of accumulation of bone mineral density and bone strength. And if you block puberty, what happens to that? That's a big concern. The research that I've seen, it's looking at the numbers as far as whether there's reduction in the bone mineral content, grams per milliliter or something like that. I don't know that they've tied it directly to injuries, but it definitely raises the injury risk if a child isn't developing as strong of bones as they should. And then there's the concerns. A lot of times what happens is, so a child goes on puberty blockers and then they'll go to cross-sex hormones, and that causes infertility. Also, when they go on the cross-sex hormones, right, that causes other challenges, because you're now taking a body that is genetically designed to have lots of estrogen as a female, lots of testosterone as male, and giving them the completely opposite hormones. And so there's a lot of concerns about that, whether it could raise the risk for blood clots or other things like that. Another challenge, while a lot of people will say, oh, puberty blockers are a pause button, what happens is, so if a transgender child is not giving any medicalization, 80 to 90% of them, they adapt to their natural biological sex, identify, male would continue to identify as a male, and maybe they're homosexual, but they don't need medicalization. Whereas if you put kids on puberty blockers, 90% of the time they continue on to cross-sex hormones, and it really cements that transgender identity into their psyche.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the committee? All right, thank you, Doctor, for being with us today.
Thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you. All right, any discussion from the committee before we get on to public comment? Senator Rhonda, do you want to say anything?
No, I just make, we heard so far from a lot of folks from out of state. I had an email from one of my constituency. I referred to your office, make sure that you should put in a record.
Yeah, Orla has received that and is working with the
I just
Secretary's
wanted to
office on it.
mention
Yeah,
that.
thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. All right, we're going to get into, as I discussed earlier, time of public testimony. Chairman Dixon and Hickman, I know you all have another committee you need to get to, so I'm going to try to get to these as quickly as I can. If you were here last time and had signed up with a lobbyist to speak, but did not see the sign-up sheet, I'd like to allow you the opportunity to go first. So if you fit that category, if you could stand here on the side, we'll take public testimony from this podium here. So if you were here last time and we did not get to you, again, thank you for making the trip for a second time. We'll give you, I guess, preferred time slot if you wish. See a couple people maybe moving in that direction. And then as you guys speak, I will just check you off the list. Once we get through with these people, I'm going to go down the list in order. There's a page 1 and a page 2 that was marked as such. And we will try to get to everyone. So with that in mind, we have about 40 minutes left in this committee's time, so that we have 14 people to speak. So try to keep your comments to 2 to 3 minutes. One thing that is helpful as well is if you could try to speak to new information if you haven't, maybe something that was not otherwise referenced. And thank you, sir. I'm going to turn your mic on. If you could tell us your name so I can go ahead and check your name off this list. We don't call you twice.
Of course, yes. My name is Ben Ackerley.
Thank you, Ben. The floor is yours, Ben.
Thank you so much. Good morning, Senators. As I said, my name is Ben Ackerley. I'm here today as co-leader of the Georgia chapter of Transparent. We're a group of more than 130 families across the state who are supporting our transgender and gender expansive kids. And as the parents of transgender youth, we want our kids to be able to participate in student athletics and athletics in general with all of their peers and enjoy all of the benefits that we know that athletics affords to kids. We've listened to a lot of testimony today about what is fair, and I can definitely say that excluding transgender and gender expansive kids is not fair. It's not the right thing to do. They should be able to participate with their peers. I'd like you to think logically about what this committee is studying now and what these speakers are advocating for. Transgender and gender expansive children aren't going away, no matter what laws are passed. They make up more than 1% of the population. As just a conservative number, it's probably more than that, but 1% of the more than 1.7 million just high school students, that's more than 17,000 high school students that would get excluded from playing. And today I was shocked to hear that there's talk of trying to exclude children as young as kindergarten. We don't even split up kids in kindergarten based on their gender when they play sports. They're co-ed for many, many years because they're all just there to play. They're there to learn and have fun and to develop teamwork skills and all of that. This isn't about competition when they're children. Practically, this doesn't make sense. A little girl whose friends know her as a girl, who's played sports as a girl for many, many years, many times from when she was 4 or 5, is then suddenly told, no, it's not fair for you to play. It's not fair for you to participate. It's bullying. It's abuse. If laws were passed to keep our kids out of sports, it's just unconscionable. As a parent, I shouldn't have to wrestle with whether or not to encourage my kid to play sports because at some point she might be told she's not allowed to. On behalf of hundreds of parents and caregivers in this state, please leave our children alone. They should be able to enjoy playing sports with their friends and benefit from participating in athletics. Playing sports and belonging to a team is about far more than winning competitions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ackerley. I'm going to say this one time, and we'll say it one time only for the duration of this committee's work. I indulge the laughter at the doctor because I don't want to interrupt the committee to really break the flow of the committee. This is not a this itself is not a sport. This is a serious matter. There are informed and emotional opinions on both sides. We will respect both of those in this committee. So we will not boo, hiss, laugh, applause. You can laugh at my bad jokes if you'd like to. If someone has a joke, you can laugh at that. But we're going to conduct this in a professional manner. And if we're not capable of doing that, we will have the room cleared. Thank you. Sir, hello. Thank you for being here today. If you could tell me your name so I can account for you here, and then the floor will be yours.
My name is, Dr. Jason Schneider. I'm a board certified internal medicine physician, and I provide care to the transgender and gender diverse community here in Atlanta. Just to speak to some of the many complex issues that have been mentioned here today by our experts. The proposed legislation that might be considered here in Georgia and laws passed across the country would not only bar transgender girls from participating in girls' sports, but will allow others to force girls, transgender or otherwise, to undergo invasive medical procedures to ascertain internal and external reproductive anatomy, testosterone levels, and genetic makeup. So talking more about the enforcement of laws in other states and what would be considered here. And so are we going to ask high school coaches or middle school teachers to say that this girl has to be subject to testing for no good reason? Additionally, schools and other organizations would be required to join in the marginalization of an already marginalized population under threat of monetary loss from lawsuits that have been mentioned here today, allowed under legislation that might be considered here in our state. Laws in other states and ones that might be considered here focus on a problem that honestly really doesn't exist. We're making a mountain out of a molehill here. My physician colleagues are highlighting some cases that stand out in the popular press, but this is a minuscule problem. The number of trans girls competing in sports are very few. Their participation in sports neither prevents cisgender girls from participating in sports nor from receiving any scholarships. Beyond the damage to trans girls, the laws in other states and ones that might be considered here could be weaponized, actually, against cisgender girls who are not perceived to be feminine enough or purposely used to attack their competitors. Is that girl too tall or too strong? Oh, I think we should test her. I think we should examine her. We need to avoid that here in our state. The preponderance of evidence shows that young trans people are already at great risk of bullying, violence, and discrimination. Laws that might be considered here in our state will be used to further the attacks against them, as well as other young people. Those seeking to protect young girls' participation in sports will find that legislation that might be considered here in Georgia will do actually quite the opposite. Instead, we would be creating an environment here in our state where all girls' bodies would be on unneeded scrutiny. Thank you.
Thank you, doctor. All right, next up, if you could do the same thing for me, just let me know your name, please.
Yep, my name is the Reverend Michael Schulte.
Thank you, Reverend. The floor is yours.
Yes, my name is Michael Schulte. I'm an ordained pastor in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and I have the privilege of serving as a pastor at the Collective in Atlanta, Georgia. We're an inclusive church for love and justice. And on behalf of the hundreds of thousands of affirming Christians across the state of Georgia, I rise to speak in opposition to any committee or legislation which seeks to exclude or discriminate against people, real human beings in our state, who are attempting only to be themselves. And I think it's important to say that when we hear from people from Frontline Policy, when we hear from people from the Alliance to Defending Freedom, all Christian nationalist, far-right groups, that they speak as a monolith for Christianity, that is just not true. That there are hundreds, if not thousands, of Christians, pastors and clergy throughout this state who believe that trans people should be able to fully participate in whatever sport they may choose. And I think too, as a Christian pastor, I'm called to witness to the hope and joy of Christ to all people, including our trans siblings. And I have the honor in my job to sit with the sacred stories of trans people as they navigate their identity and as they navigate how God could possibly love someone like them when they have to hear and listen to people who call themselves Christians host sham hearings which perpetuate violence and death. And in this hearing, I think that we have forgotten an essential truth, that trans women are humans, just like you and your daughters. That trans women should be afforded a sense of dignity, just like you and your daughters. And that trans people are created in the beloved image of God, just like you and your daughters. Trans women deserve to experience a sense of belonging. They deserve the freedom to exist as their authentic self. And they should not have to worry about legislators regulating their bodies and their participation in sports, just like you would not want your daughters to worry about legislators regulating their bodies. Trans women deserve to flourish, and they deserve to experience the American dream just like you and your daughters. And they deserve to experience unconditional love. And what hearings like this do is they perpetuate trans death. They perpetuate death and violence. And that is immoral, that is unjust, and it is not Christ-like. Trans people are more likely to experience anxiety and depression. They are more likely to experience suicidal ideation. They are more likely to be bullied, and they are more likely to attempt to take their own life. Thousands of trans individuals have lost their lives due to anti-trans violence. And as a Christian pastor, it is my job to stand on the side of human flourishing, to stand on the side of people and their stories, and to walk alongside them in their lives and to let them know that they are loved. And what this hearing does is it perpetuates a cycle of death, which is antithetical to the biblical narrative and antithetical to the work of Jesus. And so I hope that instead of bringing people from Kearney, Nebraska to speak at hearings, that we would actually have Georgians. I'm the third Georgian in 2 hearings to speak here. We have experts in our state. We have trans people in our state. We have pro-trans doctors. We have pro-trans lawyers, and yet none of them have been invited to speak at this hearing because it is a sham that is trying to perpetuate the radical rights attempt to take away young people's freedoms. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend. I have a question for you, if you'd indulge me for a second. We've heard about a number of states that have a number of different laws around this particular topic. Is there a specific state that you think does this well, and a state that you would like to see us model legislation after in Georgia?
Yes, I've actually researched in the state of Connecticut's law, which was brought up earlier, and I think the claim was brought up earlier is that in the Connecticut law that trans women are allowed to participate in women's sports, but trans men are not allowed to participate in men's sports, and that is not true. And so in the Connecticut law, children are allowed to, and teenagers are allowed to participate in the sport in which they identify. And what we can see is the education commissioner in the state of Connecticut has also released guidance, which you can find on the GLAAD website, which says that in all sporting events in the state of Connecticut, that coaches, referees, and all officials are to respect the participants' pronouns, are to call them by their chosen name. And it lays out all of these different things that we can do to make sure that we're protecting the dignity of trans people. And so I think that's actually a great state law. And I would welcome you to look at the GLAAD hearing. And also, Senator Dolezal, I've contacted your office to try to meet with you. And whenever they heard I was a pastor, they said, oh, yes, absolutely. But whenever they heard I was opposed, they wouldn't let me meet with you. So I would love to meet with you to talk personally with you about why this issue is so important.
Great, I have a follow-up if that's okay. There was reference to a Washington law as well. So essentially, if I understand your position correctly, and this may be the position of some people that spoke before you, I just didn't get a chance to ask them, or I didn't alleviate myself of the chance to ask them. And I'm going to summarize this, and hey, Senator, do you want to grab a seat? Are you here for? No, I'm sure. If you're looking for the higher ed committee, I believe that's across the street in 307. Is that correct? Is it? Okay. So, sorry. So your position essentially is, I'm not going to oversimplify this, so please give me some grace.
Absolutely.
Is there is no difference between trans women or women, trans men or men. I think that you would, or would you acknowledge that there are biological differences between the two?
I'm not a medical professional, and I would allow someone like Dr. Schneider to speak on that. I'm speaking to a moral issue that's impacting human life and causing our young people to have an increase in suicidal ideation and attempted suicide, and also that is having our young people be more likely to experience bullying and death at the hands of people committing anti-trans violence. That's what I can speak to as a moral leader. I can't speak to medicine, and I don't claim to be a doctor.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you. Next up is, I didn't catch your name, but he mentioned it. Dr.
Dr. Schneider already spoke.
Oh,
Mm,
okay. Sorry, I thought he pointed to you. My apologies. What's your name?
Okay. My name is Noelle Heatherland, and I work for Georgia Equality. And I also have a background in social work. And I would like to note that we do have copies of our testimony for the press afterwards. Since we weren't able to speak last time, we made sure to come prepared. And we'd also love a chance to sit up there and have 15 minutes of time and engage with questions with you at some point. I'm here on behalf of our organization and simply as a Georgia resident. I'm showing up in support of my transgender friends and all trans Georgians. What I believe all of us in this room can agree with is that we all care about women and girls in sports. I know many transgender women personally, and they are not transgender for any reason other than being a transgender woman is their true self. They are attempting to live their lives, and for many of them, that does not include playing sports. However, there are some that do still want access to sports for all the reasons anyone enjoys playing sports and being part of a team. It is not easy to exist as a transgender person in Georgia or most of the United States, and I can guarantee you no one is transitioning for a competitive athletic edge. As a survivor of childhood sexual abuse and domestic violence in adulthood at the hands of men, I am for taking steps to protect women. But what you are all looking to propose here will hurt both cisgender and transgender women. By cisgender, we mean someone who was named a girl at birth. I would urge you to listen to the majority of medical professionals on how transitioning with hormones affect a trans woman's body. Your experts today were in the minority, and take note of the fact that there are already guidelines within the NCAA to ensure hormones fall within a level playing field. In addition, cisgender people, that means women, many of whom are in this room, who were born being identified as a woman, have various advantages that they are born with that help them in sports. For example, Olympic gold medalist Iman Khalif is an example of a world-class athlete and cisgender woman that's been punished for being too good. Just recently, I interacted with a woman volleyball player who was not a trans person, but was close to 7 feet tall. It's a slippery slope to make decisions about who someone is based on stereotypes or how they look. Women and girls should not be afraid of being called out for being too good at their sport. If the few transgender women who do compete at a collegiate level truly were so overly advantaged, wouldn't they just win all the time rather than once or on occasion? And accidents can happen regardless of who is competing. Playing sports inherently involves risk of potential injury no matter what genders are involved. Every major medical association and leading World Health Authority supports affirming transgender people. It must be hard to compete with all your heart and lose at times, like we heard last month, or to share a trophy for a few minutes with someone you dislike or disagree with when you've been taught to hate them. Growing up, I was taught that if a person of color excelled over a white person, it was probably affirmative action or them being given preference for some DEI reason. Thankfully, I hope, have all learned to embrace other human beings as being qualified and talented who may be different from us in some ways. I have been a Georgian basically my entire life. I was born in South Georgia, raised in rural Georgia in a Christian home, and attended the University of Georgia. The women who gave testimony last month were not Georgians. These people speaking today, other than I think one person who lived here for 2 years while they worked here, are not representative of our state. And we're all speaking on a shared perspective of single incidents or small singular case studies. I am a Georgian who is comfortable competing with and sharing spaces with transgender women. Thank you for letting us speak today.
Thank you, Ms. Heatherland. And next up, if you could tell us who you are, please.
Liz Kelly.
Thank you, Liz. Floor is yours.
I am a certified and licensed athletic trainer in the state of Georgia, and I've spent my career providing medical care to and advocating for collegiate and secondary school athletes in Georgia. Athletic trainers are healthcare professionals that are trained in the evaluation, prevention, treatment, and rehabilitation of emergent, acute, or chronic injuries and medical conditions. As a cisgendered woman and healthcare provider, I am highly invested in the emotional and physical well-being of our transgender and cisgender athletes. I am in disbelief that we are wasting our time fixing a problem that simply doesn't exist. The NCAA and the IOC already have medical guidelines for transgender athletes in place, ensuring a level playing field. Additionally, Georgia has already banned transgender athletes from participating in secondary school athletics. What would further anti-transgender legislation accomplish? The NCAA and the IOC support transgender athletes and are standing firm in their support. It is a waste of time, money, and resources to pursue further bans. The state of Georgia has more important issues that need to be addressed. This is nothing short of fear-mongering. Injuries happen in athletics. Participating in sport carries an inherent risk. Are we going to start banning any athletes who injure one another? That happens every day in athletics. We would quickly run out of athletes, and I honestly would be out of a job if we started banning every athlete who injured another player. Transgender athletes do not pose a greater risk to excelling at their sport. They shouldn't compete with fear that anyone can call their gender into question just for winning. We have the right to be who we are without fear and without discrimination. We have the right to disagree with one another, but not the right to force our personal beliefs on others. The few individuals bringing forth the issue should not be allowed to enforce their beliefs upon the people of Georgia. They do not represent us.
Thank you. I have a question for you. Probably within the last paragraph or so of what you had there, you referenced something relative to normal normal hormone levels. Can you tell me? I think what you said essentially was that these trans athletes are falling within the realm of normal hormone levels, or at least the rules are forcing them to fall within that level. Is that what you said?
Yes.
Okay. We heard testimony this morning, and I'm assuming you're referencing the 10 nanomole level that was referenced earlier. We heard testimony this morning that would differ with that. Could you help me understand your perspective on that?
Absolutely. There is not enough data to say what normal testosterone is for cisgendered women. There are plenty of cisgendered women who are above 2 and probably even closer to 10. It's so variable. There is not a way for us to say definitively that if you are a cisgendered woman, your hormones are always going to look this way.
But you also told me that the IOC and the NCAA had rules in place that you support,
Yes.
which do reference hormone levels. So help me understand the difference there. If hormone levels, if there's a lack of data around that, why do you support a policy that specifically points to hormone levels?
When you're talking about trying to level the playing field with hormones, having a range that people need to fit makes sense.
Okay.
Everything is variable within human beings, and if we want to sit here and nitpick every single person's hormone levels, I
don't think anybody's
Where are
suggesting
we
that,
going?
but
Okay.
I'm trying to unpack and understand your perspective and your position. And your position, what I heard initially was that there's essentially unsettled scientific data around the hormone issue. What I heard at the top of your testimony was you support the NCAA and IOC's position. So I'm trying to understand if you disagree with the hormone levels that they're, well, you don't, because you said that you support that. So I think there's an inherent contradiction in what you're saying, and I'm just trying to understand that if it's a nuanced position that I'm not following, to give you a chance to explain that to the committee.
I got you. The NCAA and the IOC have guidelines for transgender athletes that are acceptable and that we should follow.
Okay, thank you for your testimony today.
Yep.
And next up, I do recognize you from being here last time. Thank you for coming back. If you could tell me your name, and then the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. My name's Judy Scare, and this is my husband, Chris Scare. We're the parents of a transgender, non-binary young adult. Our child is now 25 and no longer living in the state of Georgia. Fortunately, they reside in a state that supports LGBTQ+ rights while attending grad school. Despite this, our child still feels the hate when anti-LGBTQ laws are introduced. These laws don't even need to be passed, as we've kind of heard today. Their mere introduction sends a clear message that they are not wanted in Georgia by the sponsors of these bills and lobbyist groups. Our child was involved in Taekwondo during their transition to high school. The instructors at the Taekwondo studio were incredibly supportive, creating a safe space for our child to continue their practice. This was a blessing, as Taekwondo was a sport they loved and eventually earned a second-degree black belt. It's well documented that when youth participate in sports, they benefit from improved self-esteem, confidence, anxiety management, and academic performance. We are opposed to any law that would limit transgender youth from participating in sports. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll just add that athletic bans are not new to the United States. In the 50s, legislation in Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Louisiana, and Mississippi passed laws forbidding universities from playing integrated teams on their home fields. This issue came to a head during the 1956 Sugar Bowl, when Georgia Tech faced the University of Pittsburgh, which had one black player, Bobby Greer. Governor Marvin Griffin of Georgia attempted to ban Georgia Tech from participating in the game, stating, "No matter how much the Supreme Court seeks to sugarcoat its bitter pill of tyranny, the people of Georgia and the South will not swallow it." Despite its efforts, Georgia Tech did play in the game. Fast forward to 2022, Herschel Walker, a black athlete from the University of Georgia, is a Republican nominee for the United States Senate. The parallels between athletic bans of the past and the current bans of transgender athletes are striking. Both bans are driven by fear and prejudice in sports. Just as the bans on black athletes were eventually overcome, we must strive to ensure that transgender athletes are afforded the same opportunity to compete and thrive. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I believe that is the totality of people that were here last time that are here again today. So I'm going to go to the top of page 1. Michael Shutt, you were the first one to, I hope it's not shoot and I mispronounced, but you can correct me if I did. If you can introduce yourself to the committee, and the floor is yours.
No, thank you very much. I'm Dr. Michael Shutt. I'm the Southern Regional Director of Lambda Legal. I'm also a proud uncle of a trans niece, born in Georgia, who lived in Texas for a long time and just had to basically leave the state to get to a safe state. I will open with a quote from Utah Governor Cox's veto statement on a bill that banned trans kids from playing. "When in doubt, however, I always err on the side of kindness, mercy, and compassion.
They are great kids who face enormous struggles. Rarely has so much fear and anger been directed at so few. Categorical bans are a solution without a problem. Trans kids make up less than 2% of the population, meaning that trans girls make up less than 1%. And sadly, very few of them play sports. The hostile rhetoric around the issue is often premised on hypothetical and dire warnings that ignore the reality that inclusive policies have been in place for over a decade in many parts of the country without harming women's sports. To the contrary, participation has increased among women and girls in those states. Often politicians pushing for bans are unable to identify a single transgender athlete in their state. Furthermore, court after court has enjoined similar bans in litigation. And I'd like to introduce you to 3 kids, and I'd like to tell all 3 stories, but in order of time, I'll just reference one, and the rest I'll just submit later. This is actually Lindsay Hecox. This is Becky Pepper Jackson from the great state of West Virginia. And this is Luke Esquivel. I would just like to note that this is Becky Pepper Jackson from West Virginia, who I believe our colleagues from ADF were alluding to before, is the child they claim were harassing other children. But let me talk about Lindsay for just a second. Lindsay is a girl who just wanted to run on her school's track team. She, like other kids her age, turned to athletics because it's fun, and because it provided a unique opportunity for her to develop skills such as discipline, teamwork, and to form friendship of other girls. But Idaho passed a law targeting and prohibiting her from playing. Her lawsuit led to a powerful injunction from a judge appointed by the Trump administration. When confronted with argument that Lindsay isn't really harmed because she could simply play on the boys' team, the judge rightfully responded that such an argument was analogous to claiming that gay people are not prevented from marrying under the statutes preventing same-sex marriage because they could just marry someone of a different sex. In other words, Lindsay would be permanently and irreparably harmed by the ban because she would not be able to play as full stop. Lindsay's victory was affirmed by the Ninth Circuit, who upheld the injunction, clarifying that the so-called evidence supporting the bans do not involve transgender people, and that there is no compelling evidence showing that transgender women have displaced women in sports. A similar challenge also recently led to the Ninth Circuit decision upholding an injunction against an Arizona law banning trans kids from participation. Advancing a ban on sports will place school districts in a no-win situation where they will likely be subject to costly lawsuits that could end up costing the state millions of dollars to support its blanket ban on less than 1% of the population. The case law precedent has overwhelmingly supported transgender kids fighting these kinds of bans, and it's extremely unlikely that the U.S. Supreme Court will take up this issue on appeal, given that there's no circuit split. More importantly, I just want to again remind the committee that these are vulnerable kids that only want a chance to participate. I urge you to turn away from the fear and the anger targeting these kids and to turn to kindness, mercy, and compassion, and to remember that trans kids are like any other kids and just want to play, and that these decisions are being made will impact their lives forever. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor. Next up, Christopher Bruce. Thank you, Christopher. If you could just introduce yourself to the committee, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Christopher Bruce. I am the Policy and Advocacy Director for the ACLU of Georgia, that organization that keeps suing governments for passing these bans. That counts as a joke.
We can laugh at that.
Okay, there we go.
That's fair.
There we go, Mr. Chairman. Well, let's look at this, okay? Discrimination based on gender identity is not just morally indefensible. It blatantly violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Every student, regardless of their gender identity, deserves the same rights, protections, and opportunities under the law. Excluding transgender students from sports teams that align with their gender identity is a direct assault on their constitutional rights. Moreover, We speaking about Title IX, explicitly prohibits discrimination based on sex, including gender identity, in any educational program receiving federal funds. Any exclusion of transgender students is a violation of these protections, putting the state at legal risk. Let's look at this. We should be discussing the Constitution in the Georgia State Capitol, not competition. That question is in the hands about fairness. Fairness that transcends the playing field and speaks to the core of who we are as a nation. Transgender students, like all students, join sports teams to grow, learn, and be part of a community. Denying them from this experience based on baseless assumptions about physiological differences serves no legitimate state interest. Courts across the country have consistently ruled that these exclusionary policies are not only unlawful, but also discriminatory. If fairness in sports is truly the goal, then the conversation should be about ensuring equal resources and opportunities for all athletes, not singling out transgender students. Targeting these students isn't just wrong, it's unconstitutional. Mr. Chairman, I don't know, you probably have a lot of people to speak, so I can either take questions, or I would like for others to have that opportunity, because I know you're running up on time.
Yeah, you are kind. For that, there's 5 people left. I do have 1 or 2 questions for you. You said that Title IX protects gender identity. Isn't that being adjudicated in the courts right now, that the Biden administration had done an order, or I believe it was actually under rulemaking, to include gender identity, but the Title IX currently is silent on gender identity?
Well,
the text of Title IX itself.
Well, this specific text, but the interpretation goes through the executive, so it's under President Biden's purview to actually interpret it.
The interpretation of the law goes to the executive committee?
Well,
the executive branch of government?
To execute the laws of the land. That's
Correct.
passed by Congress, yes.
Sure.
Okay,
Yeah,
we're on the same page there, yes.
Well, not on interpretation, we're not, because
Not on it.
the interpretation, I believe we would all agree, is the judicial to ensure constitutionality.
Correct.
So I think that is a key hinge question here, right? Because we do have Title IX, and Title IX did what we all discussed that Title IX does, and the question that is part and parcel to this is what is the role of gender identity under Title IX? And I just wanted to make sure that we clarify the record that currently the courts have placed an injunction on that order, and that while you may assert that gender identity is covered under Title IX, there are certainly legal people that would, there are lawyers and experts that would assert otherwise. The country is divided on this question, right? You said that, the other thing that you said was that something that I tried to write down exactly what you said, the baseless assumptions of physiological differences or biological differences. I'm not sure that I'm not sure which exact word you used there, but you referenced baseless assumptions. Is it your position that there are not physiological differences between men and women?
I believe there's physiological differences between all of us. We're all unique in our nature within ourselves.
And there are not immutable characteristics among men and women, whether it's chromosomes or hormone levels, that you believe clearly define the differences between men and women.
Mr. Chairman, I see where you're going, and I see.
I'm just asking your opinion. I'm not going anywhere.
Well, I want you to read through my statement. Due to pending litigation and possible future litigation by the ACLU, I really don't want to answer that question at this time.
Okay.
But I will supplement towards this committee.
Okay, I appreciate that. I do appreciate you being here today.
Hey, thank you, Mr.
Thank
Chairman.
you. Oh,
Thank you,
sorry.
committee.
Christopher, or
Senator?
Chairman Tillery's got a question for you.
Thank you, Mr. Bruce. Your comments made me think of something. I'm kind of wondering if the ACLU has a bright line rule that they would use then on this question. So it seems like the old bright line rule used to be, for lack of a better term, I guess chromosomes, right? If it was X, Y, it was male. If it was X, it's female. What is the bright line rule now? Is it identity, or what? I'm just asking what it is.
Great. And I will supplement with the proper briefs that we've already submitted to other courts towards there. Everything's in a unique situation. I'm not trying to dodge the question. I'm just trying to make sure that the ACLU standard is correctly portrayed on the record.
Can you follow up in your brief if you haven't done that in the court already? Because my next question would be, if it's identity, can identity then flip back, or once identity is established, is it final? I'm just trying to gathered that. See if you haven't briefed that already. If you'd let
Yeah,
me
I
know.
haven't heard of that one. So yeah, let me look into that.
Do you understand the question?
Yes,
Okay,
Mr.
thank
Chairman. And if not, I'll contact your office.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Christopher.
Thank you.
Next up is Bentley Hudgens. Bentley, if you can introduce yourself to the committee, and then the floor is yours.
Yes, absolutely. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for allowing us this time to have public testimony. My name is Bentley Hudgens. I use they, them pronouns. I'm the Georgia State Director of the Human Rights Campaign. We are the nation's largest LGBTQ+ civil rights organization. So I want to address something that has not been talked about today. Today is the first day of early voting, and it is not lost on me that you decided to have this hearing on the first day of early voting. The last time we had this hearing, there were 4 out-of-state Trump surrogates that were brought in, and no public testimony was allowed. This time, we have 4 people who are Trump-aligned and spokespeople for the SPLC designated hate group Alliance Defending Freedom, who have been classified as a hate group because of their bias against LGBTQ+ people. So I wanted to start off there. This is not a winning strategy. I just want to make that very clear. Demonizing trans kids and demonizing the LGBTQ+ community through hearings where Senator Rahman tried to have one of his own expert witnesses on the docket today, and the chairman did not let that happen and decided to kick the ball down the line for the next hearing. When we have hearings like this that don't really allow for multiple different types of perspectives to be put into consideration, where we rely on just the public to come, rather than allowing members of the committee to do how they would like to purport different expert witnesses, we create a one-sided narrative that fits a campaign-style event, not a hearing with actual governance. So I wanted to be very clear about what's happening today. Right now, we are seeing a one-sided attempt to demonize, to mischaracterize, and to put LGBTQ+ children in harm's way because your party, the GOP, has spent hundreds of thousands of dollars sending mailers to people across the state with transphobic rhetoric. So this is not lost on me that today, on the first day of early voting, we decided to have this conversation about a particular group of people that is on mailers going across the state of Georgia with a one-sided demonization. And I just wanted to make sure that we had that on the record. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have any questions? I had a question if nobody else does, or more so a comment. Senator Rahman called me yesterday at 11:36 a.m. And you are correct that 11:36 a.m. yesterday, I did not change the committee's agenda for the 10 a.m. committee that we had advertised last week. So this committee's date has changed once from last week to today. We will have other committees during election season. We are not aligning dates based on early voting, late voting, runoff votes, election day, anything like that. And certainly, when Senator Rahman called me at 11:36 yesterday, we had a good conversation. And I think, as I would say, would be probably pretty universal in this building. We did not change the agenda for a committee based on a phone call that came the day before the hearing. So thank you for being here today.
Okay, can I respond to that?
No, it wasn't a question. Thank
Okay.
you. Next up is Brooke Lynn. Is Brooke here? All right. If Brooke does come back in, somebody please let me know so that we can have them come up. Maddie Frey? Maddie? Soju, I'm going to butcher the last name, so I'm not going to try because I can't make out all those letters. Soju, if you could step forward, I'd introduce yourself to the committee, and the floor is yours.
Amazing. Hello all. I'm Soju. I'm an undergraduate student at Emory University. Also studying statistics as well as specifically within the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies Department, issues of trans athletes within sports. And I also play sports as well myself. And if Dr. Brown were still here, I would have a few questions about the statistics that he was using, because I'm not completely convinced. But overall, the so-called experts who testified today, made it seem like an open and shut case, that trans women pose an existential threat to cis women in sports. But this could not be further from the truth. For starters, the evidence, and some of it was presented today, that trans women even have an advantage is lacking. Yes, trans women do in some ways have different bodies than cis women. And yes, hormones do have an impact on the body, but there is not a single credible study that shows that trans women have an overwhelming advantage in sports. In 2021, the International Olympic Committee decided that it was unethical for sports to restrict athletes without evidence. Dr. Carlson mentioned this policy. What he did not mention is that this policy specifically outlines science-based principles for determining fairness within sports. So the International Olympic Committee is requiring that individual governing bodies ensure that there is evidence-based, peer-reviewed evidence that underlines any decision made about eligibility. So World Athletics, right, the international governing body of track and field, attempted to find such evidence that testosterone gave athletes a competitive advantage. And they proved that testosterone does give elite athletes a small advantage in the 200 meter, 400 meter, and 800 meter. This is remember, elite athletes, right? So we're talking people who compete at an Olympic level. But World Athletics could not prove that testosterone gives elite athletes an advantage in the 100 meter or anything longer than 800 meters. Does this mean that trans women don't have an advantage? I mean, we all have different advantages in lots of different ways. But in most cases, the advantage is not measurable. So in practical terms, this means that in schools and in most situations, whether you have the money to get a gym membership matters more than whether you are trans or not, right? Whether you grew up near a park where you could run around matters more than whether you are trans or not. Whether what you ate for breakfast today matters more in determining athletic performance than whether you are trans or not. So is it not ludicrous to even attempt to prevent trans women from playing as women? And then we have to talk about the implementation, because how in the world are you going to keep trans women out of sports? You could do physical examinations of athletes, but that would be so traumatic for so many women, trans and cis alike. You could let individual athletes accuse each other of being trans. But it has been shown time and time again that letting athletes accuse each other of being trans means that cisgender athletes, for instance, a few people mentioned Iman Khalif earlier, get accused of being trans women, and that this specifically ends up impacting Black and brown athletes who are disproportionately accused. In fact, every single attempt to regulate trans women in sports over the past decade has resulted in Black and brown women being disproportionately affected. By attempting to protect women in sports, you're not protecting all women. You're just protecting white cisgender women. Every example that the experts from the Alliance Defending Freedom presented today were about white women and about women in sports that are generally mostly seen as white sports. This committee is about protecting white women in sports and white cisgender women in sports, not women in general. What I want to see is a world in which all women are able to play sports in a way that is personally fulfilling. This doesn't mean that we exclude trans women from sports. This means that we work towards reimagining what sports can look like. This means that we work to create sports environments where people with disabilities, transgender people, Black, Asian, people and everyone else can have a shot at competing together. I want to imagine a world where all women can play sports. And to me, it seems like this committee wants to imagine a world where cis white women win in sports. Thank you.
Thank you. I had a question, if it's okay. And again, I'm going to paraphrase here, but you essentially said there's no significant advantage for trans.
Yes, correct.
Are you speaking specifically for trans women?
So there are actually very few studies that are specifically about trans women in sports. The most well-known ones were done by a trans woman named Joanna Harper across the 2000s and 2010s. And those studies show that there is a correlation between testosterone and athletic performance. However, that correlation is quite small in a lot of cases and declines after the start of hormone replacement therapy. The study I was referencing in particular for elite athletics is a study on that was basically just about testosterone levels in general. So they measured the testosterone levels of a lot of different elite athletes, trans, intersex, cisgender, who were participating in elite level sports. And the conclusion from that was that for the 100 meter and then anything longer than the 800 meter, there was no significant impact from testosterone itself on athletic performance.
And you referenced at the end of your testimony that you'd like to see a world in which everybody competes against everybody. I think is essentially the way that there's open competition. So that leads me to my question. Do you support the existence of a separate women's category for athletics?
So I would say that I personally love women's sports. I love watching women's sports. And so I am not opposed to the continuing existence of a separate women's category. What I am opposed to is any attempt to define who can be in that category based on evidence-less claims about, like athletic advantage that have not been proven. And I am against creating these spaces where we are regulating women's bodies and we are regulating who gets to play in a way that does not create a fair or just world for anyone and does not allow people to benefit from being able to compete with all of these different people who all bring something amazing to a team.
So if you do support a separate category, how somebody has to define who participates in that category. How do you believe that should be defined?
So I play Ultimate Frisbee, which is a little bit of a countercultural sport, to be fair, but it is kind of a mix between, imagine soccer and basketball, but played on a field with a Frisbee. That's kind of the deal with Ultimate Frisbee. And our governing body, I actually serve on the LGBTQ plus advisory council for the governing body of USA Ultimate. And the policy as it stands within Ultimate Frisbee is that people just get to self-identify, and there is a section of the policy that explicitly says that self-identification must be for reasons of gender affirmation, right? People aren't allowed to just switch gender because they want to, win a championship or something. That's not happening. Also, it's called out in the policy as something that's not supposed to happen, and there are no further guidelines, right? It's literally just you get to participate in the division that best matches your gender identity.
So you
There have
oppose
been
the
no
existing
problems.
IOC policy then?
I do actually oppose the existing IOC policy. I think that it is a good model in that it calls out evidence and weighing the idea of fairness against ideas of ensuring human rights for everyone. And so there are good parts of it. I don't fully agree with the IOC policy.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Senator Ramon?
Yeah.
I'll turn you on there. Senator, you're good.
Just a quick question. Since you are, you're from Georgia, you know a lot about sports and participating in sports. Are you aware of any school, like middle school or high school, transgender, student participating, or any real issue in Georgia?
So I actually grew up in Oregon. I'm in school here, and have been in Georgia for the past 3 years. And I can't really speak to Georgia itself, but in Oregon, there are a lot of trans people participating, and I don't think that any of y'all have heard of any problems in Oregon because there haven't been any.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you.
Next up is it Evelina? If you could introduce yourself to the committee, and the floor is yours.
Hi, I'm Evelina Pierce. I am an athlete and a coach and a lifelong Georgian. So I've been coaching girls division sports for more than 10 years. I absolutely love coaching. I love seeing the way that my players grow confidence throughout the season and witness themselves physically achieving things that they could not previously do. I love watching them gain a sense of belonging in a group and learning how a group of people can become greater than the sum of their parts. I've seen in the last few years, as the youth mental health crisis has worsened, how much more meaningful the connection and belonging is to all athletes. I think we all know how much our children need that sense of connection. I believe it is important that as the adults, we act as role models of creating safety, welcoming all children to play. I think that this issue is actually very simple. As adults, we need to allow children to play as themselves. I, like Soju, play ultimate frisbee, so I know personally that I have played on teams with and against trans players. And as a competitive athlete myself, I believe that this is fair, and I believe that that makes the sport better for me as an athlete. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. Thank you for being here today. All right, next up on the list is Denise Casey. Is Denise here? All right, or Brooklyn or Maddie Fry here? All right, I believe that's through the list. Have I missed anyone? You can go ahead and just raise your hand and let me know if I have. Great, thank you. Any comments from the committee? All right, I want to thank everyone for being here today. We will have at least one more committee hearing between now and the start of our next biennial. Have not settled on a date yet for that, but we're kind of hitting a rhythm of once every 6 weeks or so and intend to probably be pretty close to that. For those of you that were here today, as part of the agenda, thank you guys for being here as well. And this meeting is adjourned.